every aspect of our opposition to nuclear power. And you're going to hear some stuff that you may not have heard before and understand why we are still opposed to nuclear power. This is a beautiful sunny day, and I knew it would be because it's a strange thing about events to do with Hinkley C. Whenever we have a rally about Hinkley C, even if it's been raining for a week beforehand, it always seems that the sun shines on us. I like to think that that's a little reminder that there is a massive source of energy which has produced all life on this planet, and which together with the moon drives the tides, drives the water wheel, moves the wind, and creates a massive amount of energy which is yet to be tapped by human beings. But of course, what we're discussing here is the brilliant, as it was, discovery that through nuclear fission you could produce a lot of heat and therefore drive a steam turbine and make electricity. And that the idea is we have to do that again at Hinkley C. Now, there's one person who would be making a speech today, and he's not here. And the reason he's not here is because, sadly, he passed away 7 days ago. And this rally here today is something which he was the mainstay of organising. And so being here today is really his last act on this earth. And it's a tribute to him as well that we're here today. And that man is Crispin Aubrey. Now, Crispin, when people were going through the difficult task of going through his stuff, and as you can imagine, he was a key organizer, which meant there was a lot to go through because we had to know what all the plans were. One of the things was he was going to make a statement today, and we've just got a few of his notes. And because we've got his notes, I'm able to say some of what I think he would have wanted to say today. But I don't have his mind and his experience, so I don't have the technical knowledge. But other people here will have that, and we'll talk about it. Crispin campaigned for 30 years in the parish of Nether Stowey against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Before that, he was quite well known as a journalist who got embroiled with the government fighting over the Official Secrets Act. He was a man who challenged the state of official secrecy and how that's used to cover things up. And then he found himself up against the nuclear industry, which is also surrounded by a shroud of secrecy, where all the key decisions are made beyond the reach of democratic control, and where if you ever raise any objections, you're told that people far greater than you are going to consider it and make decisions behind closed doors. And what that means is that if you have a hazardous industry where you can't afford for anything to go unmonitored, there is no public scrutiny of that industry. It's all left in the hands of government officials. And that means inevitably that there is a big danger of things going wrong and not being drawn to the public attention. When this planning process for this nuclear power station at Hinkley C was begun, and as you may know, it is now finished, the consultation is finished, all of us were allowed to participate in that consultation. There was just a few issues we weren't allowed to raise. We're not allowed to raise the issue of nuclear waste. We're not allowed to raise the issue of an accident at a power station. We're not allowed to raise the issue of whether or not we need a nuclear power station. Those things you weren't allowed to discuss. And now we know that the IPC is going to make its recommendation, and we're pretty sure it's going to recommend that the nuclear power station go ahead. But there are quite a few question marks over that, not least of all is the money. Because none of these private investors actually want to invest in nuclear power unless there's a way they're guaranteed a big return. And to do that, the government has to underwrite it, there has to be no insurance to pay, and somebody else will have to pick up the bill for the radioactive waste. Now, on Crispin's notes for today, he put Fukoshima-Bridgwater. And the reason he put that was because you know that in Fukushima there was a near meltdown. That hasn't happened yet, thankfully, at the existing power station at Hinkley Point. But there is nothing about the technology which is being proposed for Hinkley C which rules out the possibility of an off-site emergency at Hinkley C. And if we look at Fukushima today, people can say, well, nobody died. Nobody got radioactive sickness and died at Fukushima. And that's true as far as we know, right then. And the reason is they did everything they possibly could to avoid that. They had to evacuate thousands of people. They had to bring in all the specialists. They now are involved in a cleanup operation which is going to cost the Japanese economy £257 billion. 257 billion to clean it up if it goes wrong and to contain it. And of course, we don't actually know what the long-term cost to the health of those people will be. It won't be known until it emerges over the next 3 or 4 decades. But we do know that the villagers who've returned to the rural area around Fukushima are living with the shadow of nuclear illness hanging over them. They feel demoralized, they feel depressed, and every single thing which is grown within the radius of that power station, every pint of milk that comes from a cow, every cucumber from a greenhouse, every rabbit, every carrot, has to be treated as radioactive waste and taken away and dealt with. In other words, if there was an off-site emergency at the new Hinkley C power station, West Somerset farmers and growers would not be able to produce for many years to come, even if they were allowed home. Now, when I met Crispin recently, it was at the High Court, because as you know, some of us occupied a barn at Hinkley C development site in February. So, now EDF took us to the High Court to get an injunction against us. They wanted to get an injunction against all protesters, which included Crispin and all of you. So Crispin came to the High Court and he fought that. And he fought it brilliantly. He was a very low-key man. He was a modest man. He wasn't self-aggrandizing, but he spoke absolutely clearly and with conviction. And the judge realized there was no way that he could forbid people's right to protest, but he had to evict us because EDF owned the land. So we were evicted, and on the night before our eviction, Crispin came up, and with a wheelbarrow, him and his wife Sue worked for hours, coming backwards and forwards across the land with a wheelbarrow to take away all the stuff which had been donated by local people. Now, when we were there, we were visited by a man from the county council, who was the emergency evacuations officer. He's very appropriately named. What do you do in a nuclear emergency? His name was Mr. Hurry. Mr. Hurry came and gave us iodine tablets. He said if we heard the alarm, we had to leave the 3-kilometre emergency planning zone and take our tablets. And the reason you have to take those tablets if you live in the parish of Nether Stowey is because the first thing that happens if there's a nuclear accident is that radioactive iodine is released. And your thyroid gland is always thirsty for iodine, so it absorbs that. And what that means is that people then get thyroid cancer. And in particular, young people get thyroid cancer. That's what happens. So you have to take your pills. But you only get the pills if you're within 3 kilometres of the Hinkley C site, because apparently after that the wind stops blowing. Or maybe they just couldn't afford the tablets. Or maybe they don't want the people who live in Bridgwater and Bristol to understand that while it may be maintained safely by the very professional and skillful nuclear workers at that facility, who I don't doubt do their utmost to do it all well, if something goes wrong, then everyone within this zone is in danger. That's what they don't want to alert us to. Now, a lot of people work with hazard every day of their lives. But I want to know where that health and safety calculation is made. You know, after Chernobyl, some of the people who proposed nuclear power say, do you know what? The figures have been exaggerated. Only 3,000 children got thyroid cancer as a result of Chernobyl. Only 3,000. And with modern medical care, many of them could have been saved. That's what they say. Now, I don't know where they make these calculations, but I'll tell you, they don't make them in the waiting rooms of surgeries. They don't make them in the bedrooms of parents lying awake at night wondering if the treatment for their child's thyroid cancer is going to work. They make these calculations in front of computer screens in offices for corporations. The people, the working people of Bridgwater have to take risks. Construction workers risk their lives on a regular basis. Many people who work in the industries around Bridgwater face hazards. Firefighters face hazards. Police officers face hazards. But how many people have to take a job where they are going to expose, by the very nature of their work, expose their families and their communities to a hazard? What kind of a world is it where the people of Bridgwater and West Somerset have to take a job in an industry which potentially is going to destroy their entire community? It's a really difficult bargain that's being struck here, and we all know it wouldn't be anywhere else. They wouldn't be building a nuclear power station if there wasn't a nuclear power station here already. They're doing it because they know that in a place where people already are used to it being there, they're more likely to get away with it. They're doing it here because they know that people have just become numb to the risk which everyone in Bridgwater is daily living under. And they've also done it by putting masses of money, not in their terms, but in local terms, where the government cuts have taken away public spending. Here's a corporation to offer you money. Here's a corporation to give you a new rugby pitch. Here's a corporation to give money to Bridgwater College. And so people feel compromised. When we were camping at Hinkley, a school governor came to me and she said, I'd be up there with you, but our school has received £2,000 from EDF and I'd be compromised if I came. And so we see a kind of bribery which softens what is coming. What is coming here in West Somerset is going to be the biggest building site in Europe for 10 years, followed by about 70 or 80, because they'll always extend them, they always do, years of nuclear generation, which always could go wrong, followed by over 100 years of nuclear waste storage at that site. These barrels here represent that nuclear waste. The people who are working or are being asked to work in the preparation of this site are not just preparing a risk for their own families because they're desperate for jobs, they are also preparing a risk which will affect their children's children and their great-grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren, because from the year 2100, people will have to look after that highly radioactive waste for another 100 years at least. There will be no energy or electricity coming from the site. There will just be a huge toxic waste dump. And when I say dump, I don't just mean stuff that you have to leave alone with a fence around it. I mean stuff which has to be actively monitored by electronic equipment and computers for 100 years. And then the EDF tell us it will be taken away and put in a geological disposal facility when one becomes available. There isn't a geological disposal facility. They've been talking about it since 1970. We still haven't got one, and there's no plan to dig one. And so, you tell me, what other industry in Britain would be allowed to start an industrial process that they didn't know how to finish, to produce waste which will be toxic for thousands of years, which they didn't even know where to put? The good news is for them, they don't have to take responsibility. These future inhabitants of West Somerset will be responsible. Let's just hope that they understand their responsibility. Let's just hope that in 300 years' time, because that GDF never was dug, because they still haven't found anywhere safe to build that in Britain, let's just hope they still know how to use the computers. Let's just hope that the little electronic parts which were put there in 2012 can be replaced by other ones which they can go and get from Dixon's. Let's just hope there's a body called the Office of Nuclear Regulation in 200 years' time. I tell you what, I recently tried to find out where the boundary of Hinkley Point is. That is statutory information. It's meant to be provided publicly according to the 1965 Nuclear Installations Act. When I rang up the Department of Energy, they didn't know they had to do it because they'd been reorganised. They'd forgotten. In 20 years, a legal responsibility in that department because they've been reorganised. In 200 years' time, do you really think they're going to know exactly what the procedures were? They're going to wonder even why they have to. Will they be able to get the parts? Will they be able to get the staff? And even if they can, what kind of legacy is that for our generation to give to tens of generations to say, you will have to deal with this, whether you like it or not, because if you don't, West Somerset will be irradiated. That is what this represents, CPC. The only justification that could possibly be given for doing such a drastic thing would be if we were in an absolute emergency. And of course, what the people say, who are in favour of nuclear now, it's reinvented itself as a green eco source of power. What they say is, we're in a climate emergency, and I believe we are. Every day you can hear about extreme weather somewhere in the planet. We know that we're in a climate emergency, and we know that the government in our country isn't doing enough to find a way to decarbonise our economy. And part of the reason for that is because they've decided on this nuclear route. Not one of those power stations has been built yet. They were going to build 10. 8 of them aren't being built because the investors have pulled out. That leaves 2 owned by the EDF, who are still waiting to see if they can raise the cash to do it. So they may pull out too. It will take years to get those nuclear power stations built. The design hasn't yet been approved for the reactors. They've never been tested before, so they may go wrong. And at the end of it, what happens is, big business says, great, nuclear power, we've got energy sorted, we don't have to worry. The public money which could be going into renewables goes into supporting nuclear power. People breathe a sigh of relief. A mate of mine said, oh, apparently nuclear's all right and we don't have to worry anymore. That's what happens to people in general when they hear about it. So our movement has to do 2 things. We have to, on the one hand, say no to nuclear because it is not acceptable to impose that risk on our communities and on future generations. And I don't care if people say we can't keep the lights on. Do you know what? When I drive, as I do sometimes, into a city, and I drive because I can't afford to take the train, which is another scandal of energy waste, that we can't afford public transport. When I go into a city at night, and I see all those commercial premises, and they all have their lights on, don't they, all the time? There's a huge amount of waste in this world going on for commercial purposes. A massive amount of waste. All the waste that goes into making things, which are designed to break as soon as they reach the day after their warranty date. All the things which are produced, which break the instant your child plays with them. Which are transported halfway around the world just so they can end up in a landfill because they broke. All the energy which is wasted pouring out of the tops of every building in Britain because they're not properly insulated. And if we want jobs, and if we want to move in the right direction, why aren't we investing in getting the construction industry insulating all those premises? Why aren't we creating a future for our young people at Bridgwater College, not as nuclear engineers, but as people who are involved in R&D for renewable energy systems like the ones that can be developed at the Marine Energy Centre on this very coast? Why aren't we doing that instead? We could be doing that. Now, people are going to talk about where people are doing that in Germany and what the options are and what the investment situation is with nuclear. I just want to tell you that we know now this week's been very bad for nuclear because 3 things happened this week. The first thing was that the Cumbrian councils have said, we're not sure we do want to receive any more of your nuclear waste, and we're not sure. We're not actually convinced that our land here is stable enough to build a geological disposal facility. That means there's nowhere in Britain to build one, actually, as it happens. Secondly, the European Energy Commission has done a report on all the power stations in Europe, including Britain. They haven't revealed which ones they're talking about, but they've said that they're not fit for purpose and that all of them have to receive billions in investment to make sure that something like Fukushima couldn't happen. So that's a huge cost for energy. And thirdly, Chinese investors have pulled out of other nuclear projects in Britain. EDF will pull out as well if they can't get the investment. Now, I do want to put on record, it is an absolute shame and disgrace on them that before they know that they're going to complete this project, they have, at the Hinkley C site, destroyed ancient Quantock oak woodland, grubbed up ancient hedgerows, destroyed historic West Somerset buildings and bat roosts, and trashed skylark nesting grounds, which are the red-listed species which is meant to be protected. They've done all that, and they may never build. Now, of course, they can't repair that damage, but we still don't want them to build there. And so, the importance of this movement is that by creating the noise we create, and by actively promoting the alternatives, and pointing out to the people, like the working people of Bridgwater, that there is a different way, that actually we could have a much better way, because if we had a renewables revolution creating 1 million jobs, construction workers would have work, and we'd all be moving in the direction of a friendlier society and a more benign society. But that's not what's on offer, so it's up to us to make the noise. But furthermore, the more action you take, the more visible you become, the more likely it is that those investors will look at nuclear and say, I really don't want to get involved. So that's why it's so important you're here. And so it's important for the anti-nuclear movement you're here. And it's also important, I just want to say this, as a tribute to Crispin Aubrey, who was a tireless worker. You know, some people, they just campaign away, you don't really see them. They campaign away, they stay up until the wee hours trying to answer emails and deal with things. They have to go to endless discussions, and I know that Crispin's health suffered often because of that. Very stressful, and you always feel like people don't respond, and it's hard, and it's always the same people doing the same things. But we need to build this movement so there are more people involved, because then less people have to carry that weight. But Crispin would have been proud of what's happening here today. And to end, we just thought we'd like to have, especially in respect for all the people who knew him, who were local campaigners, we'd like to have a minute's silence for Crispin now. So if we could do that, then we'll move on to the speakers. Thanks. Thanks. We all know there's enough. Just being alive on this planet means that we all have to have our share of tragedy, we all have to have our share of grief. What we don't want to do is pursue the kind of technologies which potentially are going to increase our share of grief on the planet, and that's why we're here today. And the first speaker that I'd like to introduce to you... Oh, is it the choir first? Are you ready, choir? Right, we're going to have the choir now. We're going to have a sing-song. So if the choir would like to come up, this is the Avalon Free State Choir.